So I'm going to show you a few different techniques on how you can apply your materials a little unconventionally. And so especially with this first few weeks of this Drawing 2 course, I want to make sure that you feel like you have the freedom to really play with your materials, right? So something I want you to focus on, especially for these first few assignments, is just utilizing your materials less so in like a drawn kind of normally hold your pencil way. So this is just like a graphite lead pencil I have, right? So it's less like you traditionally hold your pencil, and really think about how you can create more dynamic shapes, marks, and just like experiment with what the material has to offer. So one thing I like to do, and I know some of you don't love charcoal, but you can do this with other materials, right? You can always use one of your just graphite pencils, like this one's an 8B, expose more of the lead as you sharpen and kind of create these different, more voluminous marks, right? So it's more about kind of using your tools as not just like, oh, observational, traditional drawing, but really having fun with like how you can kind of expressively create things, right? So especially if I'm working from observation, and maybe I do want to use, kind of redraw my little eraser here. Maybe I do want to kind of create this gestural moment and then combine my materials and kind of get more of that idea of something without it having to be too locked down in traditional drawing, right? So it's really about experimenting with the different materials that you have, right? So yes, you can do more observational things with this, but I really want you to focus on just utilizing your materials in a different way. So when you're beginning this mark making process, don't overthink it, right? Just really kind of experiment with how you can kind of create different shapes, different marks with how you apply your tools. And this is why I do like having something like compressed charcoal, Conte Crown, which is a little bit slicker, or vine charcoal, is that you can really break these into any shape that you want and kind of play with creating these different kind of marks with just how you kind of pull around your material and kind of create those shapes, right? So it's more about just kind of getting more familiar with your different tools and really kind of having fun with this more like fluid, very abstracted process, right? So I'm just gonna kind of continue to play. It definitely helps to do this more on newsprint, just so then you can kind of get a feel for it. If you have newsprint or your sketchbook is fine. So this is like a piece of black Conte Crown, and just to kind of show you the difference between doing that more gestural kind of mark making technique, I've got vine charcoal, compressed charcoal, and Conte Crown, all black. With my vine charcoal, especially when it's really kind of maybe not soft, but maybe medium, it can be a lot lighter, right? I really have to kind of push down or expose the material differently. So a lot more richness is coming out when I have more of that exposed side versus the kind of section side that's just like the outer part of the piece of vine charcoal. It's not as like, it's getting that kind of tone, but it's a little bit lighter, more atmospheric. I can play with my little sanding paper block to open up more of that material to kind of get more of that tone. Benefit to using the sandpaper block too is I'm gonna really kind of grind this one down. I can create more of a dust or powder, and you can kind of see it dripping down on this one. And I can knock that down. Now, as we know, vine charcoal is really loose, so it can be a little messy, but just that act of kind of working some of the material down with sandpaper and then letting it fall and kind of blowing it away, I created these like really beautiful dots that, yes, I could smear if I wanted to, but it's just a different way to kind of create a background and atmosphere or integrate something like that into your observational drawing techniques. With that powder, you can also use something like a brush. This is just a bamboo brush I have in my studio. Most other brushes will work, but you can kind of blend out the tone, less with your finger, less with a blending stump, and really kind of work in some of these beautiful brush strokes as you kind of pull the tone, right? And of course, if we're working with something very soft and loose like this, definitely want to eventually spray fix it if it's something that we like. But you can kind of continue this experimentation with sanding something down and really using it to kind of not only build up tone, but maybe I'm using the brush to kind of push the tone away and just experiment more with that type of mark making, right? Now, of course, when I go to like a compressed charcoal, remember compressed charcoal is a little bit more rich, a little bit more stuck on. So you can see it sticks more to my sandpaper block. These are gonna do a similar effect, but you see it didn't come off as easily like I had the other charcoal, right? And kind of slowly removed. But it can be nice to step down an overall tone, and then maybe you're using your fingers as a kind of reductive technique and see how you can pull back shapes, pull back marks, right? And then kind of pull that material back up. Of course, my hands are super dusty. When in doubt, if you don't like something that you're experimenting with, your chamois or just like a really kind of like a tissue paper, something like that is a great way to kind of set back to like a neutral kind of atmospheric tone and then restart the process, right? So it's not necessarily about having this like beautiful finished drawing. When you're experimenting with these materials, really just get a feel for different ways of using them, applying marks to the page, applying tone to the page, and kind of don't be afraid to like make something you're like, okay, not really super thrilled about that. Do it again, flip the page over, go to a new page, just keep experimenting, right? Because in the process of doing this, hopefully you're spending like, I don't know, at least 30 minutes just kind of playing with materials. You might land on something that you really like, right? And I really do like these, they almost like look like little pasta shapes that maybe if I keep overlapping with a darker material, it'll kind of build up this like mark making, almost like ink kind of tone. And I can start to play with shading something more realistically. I'm gonna just pop in a sphere, kind of give you context. Let's say I'm kind of using this more free kind of mark making technique. Of course, lighter pressure, I'm gonna end up with a lighter kind of tone. And then I have this kind of like more tactile version of a shaded sphere. And maybe I like that more. Maybe that brings more like expression into my work. And it's something that, you know, I wouldn't have thought to do if I was just using, you know, my Conte Crown and my compressed charcoal in that traditional way. So we've done with the vine charcoal, right, which is a little bit more faint, unless, of course, you kind of open that material up. We've done the compressed charcoal, and then the Conte Crown. You can see that I'll get more of these kind of streaks depending on one if my Conte Crown's new, but I feel like your Conte, because it does have that wax coating, it will hold more individual lines within your marks, right? So I think this one, especially if you like longer, kind of more expressive movement, this one's great, right? Because it has that built-in cross contour in the way where necessarily, you know, this has more of like a kind of just grainy texture. So really just play around with just different ways of kind of applying your material. Maybe I am using a flat square of my Conte to kind of get these little stipples, these little marks. Just really experiment with it. And don't necessarily forget about just that benefit, really dusty, you know, of having that kind of general tone and using a different tool to kind of work out the shading, right? I find that especially vine charcoal, when you kind of have like some that you use your sandpaper block or any kind of sandpaper, put some tone down, and then it becomes really fluid. I can kind of pile it over to the side and kind of just have a more painterly effect with applying my tone, right? So really do experiment. Something else you can think about, right? I have this toothbrush. I do a lot of printmaking. I promise this is not the toothbrush that I use to brush my teeth, but I do use it to clean my relief blocks, right? So maybe you're getting unconventional tools, right? Because brushes, I feel like, might be something that's already in your drawing kit, but maybe you're just kind of experimenting with how you can kind of pull and create more movement in your work that maybe just a piece of vine charcoal or a piece of compressed charcoal isn't going to really do for you. This kind of lets you use a tool that has a little bit more of like a back to it and kind of play with that level of abstraction and not being as representational in your work in the beginning. Or maybe this is the end game. Maybe it is about the expression. Maybe it is about your relationship between how you pull down the material the relationship to your mark making, to your body, and that kind of thing. So again, it's fine to kind of have these more like quick studies, shift to a new paper, blow the dust off, you're going to switch material, and then go from there. One other thing that I definitely encourage you, at least one other thing, is don't necessarily forget, let's see, this is a 9B pencil, which is probably like the apex of my graphite darkness, about just doing more of a continued or a continuous line drawing, right? So I'm kind of looking at my studio. I have a lot of random objects in my studio. One's my little speaker, right? But not only, maybe it is something that you're working observational. Next to my speaker is this little fan. So something too, as you practice and kind of revisit some of the techniques that you probably learned in drawing one, is having this idea of a continuous, like really expressive gesture drawing, right? And having that continuous line kind of come into play, right? And kind of really develop the sense of, you know, really moving through space, calculating what you see, playing with your volume. But then on the flip side, maybe you're just doing something more expressive, not necessarily looking at anything, kind of like scribbling in all honesty, but having a continuous line that feels more one connected to, maybe it's an emotion, maybe you're just kind of playing with filling up the space, maybe it's a type of mark making, right? And then you kind of revisit as you continue through this. Maybe I'm making some like more rhythmic kind of movements with my wrist, maybe they get more scribbly, maybe they get more geometric in places. But then maybe I'm like, okay, I look at all this kind of scribbled mess, and yeah, super fun to do, it keeps you loose. Maybe you're introducing your next hand, right? And kind of doing more from a top down, kind of using your non-dominant hand to get even weirder. But maybe that you find that you like some of these shapes, right? In the mess and in the kind of gestural, like chaotic warm-up. Maybe I find like, okay, this is a really interesting abstracted shape here. Kind of outline it a little bit more. So maybe this shape I want to play with, and maybe this shape I want to kind of bring in some kind of volume, some kind of tone, and three-dimensionality to the rendering. And you start kind of playing and experimenting with what was once chaos and just mark making and just lines, and you start to bring in maybe some amorphous shapes. Maybe you start to see things in the gaps. Maybe you're just still playing with tone as you kind of build up this like really abstract kind of textured drawing, right? So when you're thinking about this kind of exploration of materials, surface, and just kind of really just going for it without having like a clear observational reference necessarily, just continue to experiment and play, right? Because this, I feel like, is a great way to just really open up your process. It practices the skills that observational drawing offers, but it's just kind of seeing them in a new way and a new potential, right? Where before, maybe you were really like, okay, this tone has to match exactly what I see, but now there's more freedom, right? Because you kind of know how to create that three-dimensional feel, but now I have all the freedom in the world to really play with, okay, what does that mean, right? Do I play with everything being on the same plane, or is this just kind of like a really surreal gesture drawing that has some like tangible objects and some that are just textures in the background, right? So keep experimenting with the materials and just kind of don't get too settled on like, oh, this has to be an exact replica of this beautiful pot or beautiful shape that I have like sitting in my excuse me, in my house, right? And you can kind of experiment more with what some of that means, right? Maybe I have this atmospheric kind of tone over here. Oh, actually, that worked out. Bring my chamois into play, kind of smooth out some of this darker tone where it gets a little more atmospheric in places. Maybe I do the same thing, but instead I use my compressed charcoal to kind of live in that chaotic, expressive mark making world. And like, how do I integrate that with those other graphite elements, right? So I love parts of this, I don't love all of it, but the whole point is just to kind of really experiment with both the material, how you relate to the paper, how you create tone, marks, shapes, line, and just really kind of play with what you can do with drawing materials in a non-representational or abstracted way.